Dzień dobry, good afternoon. Let me introduce my dear colleagues from the think tank world in our session of Zoom the World series. My name is Małgorzata Bonikowska, and today I will be meeting and talking to two gentlemen from Washington, Tony Silberfeld. Hello, Tony. Good afternoon.
Hi,
Nice.
Małgorzata. Good to see you.
Nice meeting you. Tony is our dear friend and partner from Bertelsmann Foundation, and he's dealing with the transatlantic relations in the foundation. And actually together we are implementing a project covering actually the transatlantic trends and relations between several EU countries and the US. And Stephen Ezell. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, good afternoon.
Great to have you with us. You are also in Washington right now. Stephen is a vice president of Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, covering basically innovations, but also, cooperating with business, startups, and all these people who try to develop our world and bring us into the 21st century. We are already there, but we can be much more advanced. And we would like to talk about something our two colleagues maybe don't discuss on an everyday basis. We would like to talk about the perception in the US among the Americans, American society, but also the circles, internal circles in Washington, in the capital. How do you see what's going on in Central Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, especially because of the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression to this country? I don't need to tell you how worried we are here in the region and how the American presence and NATO performance is crucial for us during these weeks and months. So let me start with Tony, because here this transatlantic periscope, the project you are leading and heading in Bertelsmann, it can help also to understand. From what way, how the Americans really, if any, changed during these last 9 months of the war? And in what direction do you think the perception of the events is heading?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's nice to be with you. I'm glad you mentioned the word changed over these 9 months, because it really has changed dramatically, I think, over 9 months. If you go back to the very beginning of the crisis, going back to February, I would say that Ukraine, Central Europe wouldn't have registered very often on Americans' radar, the average American. Forget it, setting aside the people who work in think tanks and focus on foreign policy, it wouldn't have registered. Beginning in February, when the pictures came onto our screens and onto our phones, I think a great number of Americans all of a sudden were paying attention to a threat that is very common to all of you living in Central and Eastern Europe over decades. This was new to all of us.
Let me interrupt in one moment, because I understand that the Americans were have been always curious about what's going on in Russia or previously in Soviet Union. So this wasn't a discovery, but the discovery was maybe existence of Ukraine as a country, and of course Central Eastern Europe as well, as a neighborhood to the war.
Yeah, I mean, and my reference was primarily about recent events beginning in February. I mean, surely in 2014, if you go back to the Crimea invasion as well, it did pop up on our nightly news on a daily basis for a time. We have very short attention spans in this country, particularly when it comes to foreign policy issues, and it fled very quickly, and it became back of mind for people who weren't working on it on a daily basis. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the issue around Russia, Soviet Union, the interest in it is decades old and has been part of our national discourse, but it comes and goes depending on events as they transpire. And so if you fast forward then to February of 2022, and we saw these pictures on our screens of Russians invading a neighboring country, it really resonated with people here in the United States. And people wanted genuinely to understand what was happening. And for many of us, it was new. We couldn't believe that we were seeing the things that you only would have seen maybe in the 1980s, maybe if you go back even further to the 1930s and 40s. This was really a shock to a generation of Americans who are not seeing this on a day-to-day basis.
But it was more like a shock because of the place where this war happened, not because of the war per se, because Americans it has been a while that American soldiers participate in so many wars all over the world.
Yeah, I think the nature of it, certainly in the location of it, was jarring to a lot of people. I mean, if you think of if you ask Americans, what do they think about when they think about Europe? They think about vacation destinations. They're not thinking about warfare. They're not thinking about geopolitics. They're thinking of the Eiffel Tower. They're thinking of beaches. They're thinking of the things that they want to go vacation to see. So this really was dramatic for a lot of them. But as difficult as it was to see, it was important that it got people thinking about what's going on out there. And people were asking for the first time. We were getting a lot of calls and a lot of questions about, how can you explain what's happening here? What does it all mean? What are the implications? Should we be surprised? There were a lot of questions that we were in, conversations that we were having with people about what this is all about. You also know, I mean, you talk about perceptions, and maybe Stephen will have a view on this as well as another American on the panel. Americans as a people, if I can say, are culturally predisposed to rooting for the underdog, and always are predisposed to being interested in underdog stories. And when you see a situation like Russians invading Ukraine, it is a natural narrative for both the American press and for the American public to consume this underdog narrative, and it gets people to rally around a group of people who are under siege. And that's what we saw. And I found it to be a very interesting narrative right from the very beginning, that from members of Congress all the way down to the average person on the street could understand. It wasn't so distant and so technical that you couldn't wrap your head around it. It was a story to be told that everybody could understand.
Right. Stephen, so let me ask you now, because you are much less on the everyday basis involved in watching, the geopolitical news. What was the reaction what was your perception also of this conflict at the very beginning, and how would you describe the change during the last 9 months?
Well, I think there was certainly shock and surprise that Putin actually went ahead with his invasion of the Ukraine. Obviously, the American people are fully on the side of Ukraine in the defense of a free democratic society. I think all elements of American society are quite frustrated when another nation violates the territorial sovereignty of another country. Our nation went to war in the Middle East against Iraq over their invasion of Kuwait. So certainly there's a large response among the U.S. population to that kind of incursion. Connecting it with other geopolitical issues going on. Obviously, we have global inflation at 10%. It's averaged 7% in the United States over the past 12 months. And certainly, there are many factors behind that. But, obviously, a large part is the increase in gas prices as a result of the invasion in Ukraine. So people are seeing the consequences of this action hit their pocketbooks, and the cost of gas and the cost of grain and foods. So that's been another factor, I think, driving U.S. opinion strongly against Russia in this situation. I would also add, however, that I think there's a real war fatigue in the United States. We've been fighting in the Middle East for over 20 years now. And to some extent, especially now, we have a war that's dragged on for almost a year, in at least 8 or 9 months in Russia. And there is a sense that it's the back of the news. We have other concerns: inflation, economy, house prices, our own.
So if I understand you correctly, let me just interrupt for a moment. You say that despite the shock that Anthony was talking about, at the end of the day, people are much more interested in really what's happening at home, and even such a scale and such a radical discovery that the war can happen in the middle of Europe almost. It doesn't change the fact that the other topics are much more covered or interested to the American public, right?
My sense is that if you ask the average American on the street in Peoria or Omaha, that they're far more concerned with issues that affect their individual daily lives more than, well, a serious geopolitical issue, a war frankly far away in the middle of Eurasia.
And let me also ask you about the business approach to that, because that's a slightly different perspective also because of Russia as an actor. Maybe it's a huge country and a lot of businesses were doing business in Russia, American business included, many. And some of them, if not all, they had to stop operations. That's number one. Number two is we are talking also about Russia as the future a future potential country to do business with. So how the American business would see the consequences of the war?
Well, by and large, Russia is a minor market and not truly significant as a source of like foreign direct investment in the United States as compared to other countries like China or other East Asian countries like Korea or Japan. So, that's one consideration. Obviously, we've had over 1,000 Western companies leave or curtail their operations in Russia, including at least 500 U.S. companies, obviously everybody from McDonald's to the accounting firms. So certainly it's going to have a business impact. But on the meta scale is outside of gas, and maybe some grains and some very specific things like neon and gases, and like the semiconductor industry. Yes, what's driving policymakers in Washington? It's all semiconductors. The high-tech war with China, and frankly, Russia's a side player in that domain. So when we're talking about the strategic advanced industries of the future, solar panels, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, ICT, Russia's a big player, and that's a factor. Obviously, also Russia's economy has shrunk considerably over the past 20 years. Decline in their own population, a decline in their economic output, their the trade levels with the United States. So, yes, it has had business impact for sure, but I think compared to other issues like U.S.-China trade tensions, it's not as high on the radar screen.
Well, let me get back to Tony because of this, Russia element that everybody knows that Russia is there. And even if the war is over, Russia will be there. So if you can just tell us a little bit, what is the thinking about the future between the US and, of course, China, but also China-Russia possible partnership, which was observed before the war, a kind of alliance these two countries had. And now, still, China is in a way not condemning Russia. So how does this matter to the United States, and in what way the elites in Washington and the think tanks, can see the future of the relations with Russia?
It's a really difficult question because it's looking so far past the really difficult challenges we have right now, but I can venture a couple of guesses anyway. The first place I want to start, though, is with the politics and the political landscape here and how that impacts how we view Russia today, how we view China today, and then moving forward into what might come next. We had an election here 3 weeks ago, and while it wasn't as dramatic of a shift as many people had expected, there are still going to be substantive changes coming here in Washington over the course of the next couple of weeks that are probably worth noting. When it pertains to Ukraine, Russia, and beyond, it's probably worth digging into what the Republican Party looks like right now. Also, to some extent, what the Democratic Party looks like, but we can maybe touch on that a little less in a moment. The House of Representatives is going to be controlled by the Republicans with a fairly slim majority. I think it'll be around a 7 or 8 seat majority in the end. They'll set the agenda in the House. The Senate will still remain in the hands of the Democrats. So we'll have a divided government in the United States. So it means that the White House will have very limited options in certain areas. And when it comes to spending and dealing with investigations, there's a lot to contend with. So that's why I hedge a little bit about the future, because I think we're going to be so consumed by the present, it's going to be difficult to look ahead. But when I think about what the Republican Party is looking like at the moment, particularly when it comes to Russia, I think you're seeing a very divided GOP. I think you've got the old school Reaganite types that are still there in the Republican Party. And then, for lack of a better term, you have the more Trump-oriented Republicans who would be more favorable toward Putin and toward Russia and perhaps not as supportive of continuing support for Ukraine. And so you have this division within the Republican Party about the direction to take in the near term. Certainly that's going to impact what comes next and what happens in the long term. So you had Kevin McCarthy, who may or may not be the Speaker of the House, we'll find out in a couple weeks' time, saying just a few weeks ago, might have even been less than that, that the days of a blank check for Ukraine are gone. That startled a lot of people, I imagine, in your part of the world. It did in the United States, it did in Washington, because they're actually, if you look at the voting numbers, both in the House and the Senate, there's a substantial majority for support for Ukraine for all of the assistance packages to date that have come. But there's enough of a rumbling and the margins are narrow enough where you might want to start thinking about how those changes might impact the situation on the ground. So I don't want to go on too long, but I think it's important to think about how the domestic politics here are going to dictate what comes next. And that's why I hesitate to go beyond the next 6 months, because it's right now it's really difficult to read. For Republicans and for Democrats, right now it's a numbers game. It's about counting votes. What can they count to 218 in the House on anything? What can they count to 60 in anything in the Senate? There's not a lot there. And so I think there's going to be a lot of really difficult discussions ahead.
In any way, for us, it's important to remember that, in the US, it's not that we have just one group of people thinking in one way. We have still the discussion. And even in such an important issue, and to us, such a clear issue like the war in Ukraine, the future is a little bit unknown, in a sense that the opinions within the political circles can differ. Stephen, I would like to ask you about what you said about China, because you said, and we know that the Americans, the business, but also the political elite pays much more attention to China, or generally to what's happening in Asia or Asia Pacific, than to Europe. But do you think because of the war and because of Russian aggression, somehow, Europe is back in a perception of Americans, or it's still really a secondary place vis-a-vis what's the Americans focusing, vis-a-vis China and the Chinese neighborhood?
Well, the Obama administration talked about, the great pivot to Asia, which never quite happened in its entirety. I think the challenge for U.S. policymakers is to walk and chew gum at the same time when it comes to the interest that we have from a security and economic perspective in Asia and Europe. It's one of the challenges we have by dint of our geography ourselves. I think the reality probably is that the policy-making attention today is probably 60% oriented towards the Asia region and maybe 40% to Europe on average. Certainly from both a U.S.-China economic and trade perspective, as well as U.S. concerns about China's potential designs on Taiwan and the security commitments that would mean America would have to bring to bear potentially in the Asia region, probably even despite what's going on in Europe is probably still the leading concern of U.S. defense planners, I would say, is preparing for potential conflict in the Asia theater over Taiwan. Now, of course, all this could change instantly should Putin decide to get more aggressive in Central Europe. But I think, by and large, the focus is number one is still China and Asia for U.S. policy.
And do you think the American business and also those people like you who promote innovations, who try to, cooperate with the whole world as far as exchange of, data and creating the ground to really develop new technologies, do you think that the coupling from China, something which was, launched and somehow promoted by the Biden's administration, is maybe not wanted because it's not wanted, but it's feasible? It's really possible to do it, or it's just a slogan that it will never happen?
Well, it's unlikely in the absence of conflict, military conflict, that there would be a full decoupling between, the United States and China. But by and large, what businesses in America or other countries crave is stability, predictability, and certainty. And in an increasing number of ways in China today, whether it's the COVID-19 lockdowns, whether it is regulations that China has promulgated around privacy or cybersecurity, or the ability to tap into data flows. I think we're seeing a increasing note of caution of U.S. firms in their engagements with China. Interestingly, the American Chamber of Commerce in China just came out with their 2022 annual report last week, and it had some interesting findings. For instance, nearly twice as many U.S. companies cut their investment in China this year as compared to last year. 1/3 of respondents redirected planned China investments to other destinations in the past year. There was certainly some evidence of some trade diversion to other East Asian nations as a source of exports. 9 companies cut their investments by over 30%. So we're not going to see a decoupling. But I think especially in areas where China is increasingly less cost competitive, we're going to see some decrease in investment over time. Analysts expect that by 2025, Apple will be making nearly a quarter of its phones in India, not China. And in my view, that's kind of the tip of the spear for maybe how this trend is going to unfold over the course of the coming decade.
Mm-hmm. Tony, I would like to use your experience in transatlantic relations because as we can say, well, unfortunately for us, but maybe fortunately for NATO and for transatlantic relations per se, meaning the Americans and the Europeans now are on one track and seem to be really kind of united around the issue of Ukraine. In what way do you see the change from the American perspective, from how the Americans see it, the role of transatlantic relations for you, for the US?
That's been a challenge for a really long time, trying to explain to Americans why Europe matters, right, geopolitically, right? It's a really big challenge. And I think you started to see people understand when their gas prices went up. They could see, even though we're fairly self-sufficient when it comes to domestic oil production, they could see that the invasion of Ukraine and the Russian gas issue was a shock to global markets. So there was a direct knock-on effect to people's pocketbooks. And so if you can make that connection, even if it's a bank shot, it's still something that people can understand. And so it really is an ongoing challenge for us as think tankers, as Americans, try to explain to our compatriots why Europe is important. I think we do ourselves not a lot of favors when it comes to how we talk about the Europeans, when it comes to political engagement. We have, and you and I talked about this before, Małgorzata, about the whiplash that Europeans must experience every time we swing from one administration to the next. It's very difficult for an American who's watching this peripherally to say, oh, well, Europe's important today and it really matters, but in 4 years, actually, it doesn't matter at all, and Europeans are not useful in any way to American interests. It's really hard for the average American to follow what is important, what is not important. And so our job is to try to bring some consistency to that discussion and say, well, here's why it matters. I think that, I'd love to hear Stephen's views also on this when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act and the tensions now being caused between the Americans and Europeans about protectionist trade policy. If we're telling everybody, you know what, this only works if we're doing it together, but yet we keep enacting policies that cause friction, we're really undermining the argument that we're trying to make that actually we can only do this together. I heard just recently, I think it was Dan Fried was talking about how when we think about China, the only way that we can actually compete with China and maintain a reasonable policy with China is if the transatlantic partners do it together, if they're coordinated. Otherwise, it's impossible to do what we need to do. So I am curious, Stephen, I don't know if you have any views on sort of the back and forth between, going from one administration to the next, the friction, the unnecessarily, own goals that we score on ourselves. I'm curious if you have a view on that too.
Well, yeah, I mean, going back to the Trump administration, the prevailing narrative was that, the NATO partners were ones that didn't carry their own weight. especially with regard to the share of GDP being contributed to the common defense in NATO. That was, of course, exacerbated by the trade tensions, the steel and aluminum tariffs, for instance. And then, yes, when the Biden administration came in, it was to great fanfare that maybe we could put some of those ruffled feathers aside. And initially, we made some good progress. For instance, we finally came to a resolution of a long-running Airbus-Boeing dispute over civil aircraft subsidies, resolved some of the steel and aluminum tariffs. So there were many steps in the right direction at the start of the administration. And then, yes, Tony, to your point, this Inflation Reduction Act, which has as one of its pillars 7,500 tax credits for electric vehicles, so long as they are assembled in North America, has certainly raised concerns in Europe about potential impact on European automakers. And Tony, I absolutely agree. It's a self-inflicted wound. It's an own goal that certainly, addressing climate change, facilitating the transition to a clean energy economy is very important. But hopefully we can find some ways to get around this. Of course, it only applies to the tax credits available to manufacturers of all countries, so long as they're in the U.S. But we did make an exemption for Canada and Mexico. Perhaps something can be done in Europe, because I am quite sympathetic to the European point that as a member of the WTO, the U.S. commits to principles of national treatment, reciprocity, and non-discrimination, which means that by law, our policies must treat companies equally, whether they're domestic or foreign. And this legislation runs directly afoul of that commitment. And it's not good enough for a nation like ours that wants to be a standard bearer along with our European allies for market-based rules-governed trade.
And I want to ask you, Stephen, also about this initiative your foundation launched to cooperate with the think tanks from actually all over the world. We are also one of the partners in your network. But just to summarize, what role the think tanks from Europe can play in such a networking organization vis-a-vis the think tanks from other parts of the world, especially from Asia. We've just met in Seoul, which is South Korea, and that is also that's significant that there are many more maybe brilliant ideas, and much more this cooperation is visible between the Northern Americans and the US as a country and US business and the partners in Asia. So how do you see really business-wise and innovations-wise the position of Europe?
Well, about 5 years ago, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation launched an initiative called the Global Trade and Innovation Policy Alliance, GTIPA. It's a network of over 50 like-minded world-leading think tanks from over 30 countries that have come together to collectively amplify our collective voices for a positive vision of trade, globalization, and innovation that if done on market-based terms can maximize welfare for the world's citizens. But it's delightful to have key European think tanks, including Think Tank, as part of this alliance. And the European think tanks are extremely important in this environment for several reasons. One, European countries, by and large, have some of the world's leading kind of innovation and technology policy environments. Many European countries are at the forefront of thinking about innovative instruments like R&D tax credits or innovation vouchers to support innovation. So having that perspective that European think tanks can bring into the alliance is very important for the global community to learn best practices of how we support greater levels of innovation in our societies and economies. Also critically important is standing with European partners to really support high standard rules of rule for global trade and to ensure that these are propagated across the world. Actually, the European Union, has far more free trade agreements with other nations than the United States does. So in that way, you're a standard bearer, flag bearer for free trade, and we need to get those principles, I think, propagated more deeply globally. And European think tanks are really important in delivering the message of how market-based trade can benefit global society.
Tony, to you, I would address the question about the changes in American society, because what we are talking about, it's also a reflection of what is the US per se, what is the American society per se. And we know, we commented in Europe, we have this impression that the Americans have changed also as a society. It's not only about the way how deeply you are polarized, but it's also about just the society per se. It's less and less the Americans with European roots, and there are many more Americans with roots all over the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America as well. The language is also changing in the sense that the role of Spanish is growing. Chinese is more and more popular. So we know that around 60% of the Americans are now descendants of the European immigrants. The rest will be the rest. So how would you see this factor matters in the way how the Americans see Europe, and also such, as you say, incredibly unexpected events like Russia invading Ukraine, a European country?
So maybe just a couple of points I want to make about this. One is, even though it was difficult to make the case going back a generation about the importance of the transatlantic relationship, it was a lot easier in those days because almost everybody you knew, your family, your neighbors, everyone had some connection to Europe for the most part, right? Whether it was friends or your own family. Everyone was Italian American, German American, Irish American, and we all wore those colors very proudly, but we were all Americans, right? It was kind of and I'll get back to the mythology of America in a second, but it was this myth that there was this big melting pot and everybody got along and it was wonderful. But it made life a little bit easier to talk about why certain connections were important, because at least they had somebody with those direct connections to Europe. So that was then. When I look at where we are now, I mean, you talk about the demographic change. That is very clear. And it means that we're going to have to redouble our efforts to make the case why those connections are important, because those natural ancestral connections aren't there anymore. They're elsewhere. They're in Latin America, they're in Asia, they're in Africa, they're in other parts of the world where there's a more natural affinity for those places.
And this is also visible in your elite. When you look at who is in the American Congress, in the administration, there are more and more people who don't have these roots in Europe.
It's changing. I mean, I used to work on Capitol Hill and worked for a member of Congress who was an Irish American. And there were always 535 members of the House and Senate. I would say 534 of them would claim some Irish ancestry, even if they didn't really, they actually have it. And that has changed, of course, right? The demographics in Congress have changed. Among elites, it has changed. But certainly at the public level, it has changed.
Maybe this is better for the American society, but it's much worse from the European perspective, because we can count on you less in a way.
I would say that's probably true, but I think we have a bigger problem than just where we come from. I think that, and again, like Stephen knows technology better than anybody, so I'm curious if he has a view on this as well, but I think a lot about the American mythology, about who we are versus who we say we are. Right? And the stories that we've been told over time. I spend a lot of time talking to my kids about what they learn in school, about what America is. And the gap between who we are and who we say we are is growing every year. And I think that we need to come to terms with that as a society. I think the Europeans need to realize that this actually is who we are. You know, we keep doing these things over and over where we put up a flag and we say, actually, we're not all of the things that we pretended to be when it comes to democratic values and freedom and liberalism and progressiveness. We may not be those things. And I do think that technology has played a really significant role in puncturing that veneer of mythology, because we now see each other for what we actually are. I'm not saying that cyberspace and social media platforms is necessarily indicative of reality, but it definitely gives us a little window into how people think about things when they're not, when they can just be there. I really am troubled by seeing who we really are. And I'm not that impressed at the moment with who Americans are. We get a chance every 2 years to cast a vote to determine who we want to be as a society and as a country. And I'm increasingly concerned by what those results reveal. it says that we're more nationalistic. We're more interested in white Christian country that was not really what we said we were going to be. I'm disturbed in a lot of ways, and I think that the Americans need to realize that. I think the Europeans will be better off if they come into this relationship with wide eyes and clear eyes that this is who we are, and should maybe calibrate their expectations accordingly. This isn't what they thought. I don't know. I might be too pessimistic about it. I might just be having one of those days, but that's how I feel about it today.
Stephen, how is your perception of this identity, let's say, issue, and how do you see Americans can see themselves also as leaders in innovations and, you know, business-wise also as a power who is able to, well, lead the world as far as, you know, new concepts, new businesses, and also the power of change or to change the world?
Well, I guess one comment I'd make, and I think it is a common strand across the United States and Europe, and more broadly globally from Mexico to India, is that there's been a real rise in populism. Trump is reflective of that. We see these increasing vote shares for these types of populist or more right-wing parties, you know, from Germany to France to Sweden, right? And there's a sense among that part of our society that not only has globalization failed, but leaders have failed at orchestrating globalization. And the reality is, when America loses 1 million manufacturing jobs over the course of a decade due to unbalanced trade with China, as economists at MIT, including David Otter, wrote, that skepticism is fairly placed. And when it comes to a range of failures on our policymaking elite, from not pushing back adequately on China's innovation mechanism, to not having adequate programs in place to facilitate with trade adjustment assistance or shepherding these types of individuals in new parts of the economy, it absolutely gives rise to populism. And it directly explains the emergence of a leader like Donald Trump. So I think it does point to a real challenge that policymakers have to own up to on both sides of the Atlantic, that they have to do a better job of architecting globalization in a way that not only benefits those in the developing world who we rightly want to bring into a globalized economy and increase our standards of living, but to do so without compromising our own. And in that way, we failed. In a number of ways, our policymakers have failed to keep their promises to the American people on a range of things, from how much debt we're accruing as a society to, you know, what healthcare plans we can choose. So, and we throw the COVID-19 pandemic atop that, where there's been a veneer of questioning expert opinion in the United States. So I think I don't want to just say there's something wrong with our people. That's part of it. And of course, the people of the politicians. So that's the extension. But that doesn't excuse policymakers from not being world-class themselves, and to really be the, you know, in my view, you know, one of the big things we've experienced is redistricting, is gerrymandering. Only about 10% of U.S. House seats are competitive today. And when that's the case, then in these primaries, you're just getting either the most extreme Republican or the most extreme Democrat elected. So there is a real loss of a centrist policymaking apparatus in the country. And I think that has really done significant damage to the quality of the leadership that we're bringing to Washington, D.C., and vicariously in terms of our ability to handle some of these challenges.
But I must ask you about globalization again, because you said that you know, the leaders on both sides of the Atlantic should handle it better. But what about also China? Because that's exactly what, you know, who may be a leader of globalization right now, because China benefited extremely from the globalization and doesn't want this globalization. It seems like it doesn't want this to stop. And we had a summit of G20 where President Biden and Xi Jinping met for the first time, also talking about more or less the same thing, how to, you know, not to go on with this possible big clash between these two powers, because, well, global trade, innovations, all what you do, Stephen, need really a peace in the world, need globalization to continue. So how do you see the future of globalization from this perspective?
Well, in our view, China wants globalization, but it just wants globalization on its terms, not on WTO terms that it's signed up to. Um, and there's no question that there's a battle being fought right now for the soul of the global trading system, and will private enterprise-led market-based rules governed WTO consistent mediated or based trade win out, or will what we term China's innovation mercantilism, which over the past 2 decades has undoubtedly been marked by large levels of IP theft, massive industrial subsidization, forced technology, forced IP transfer, forced local productions, and conditional market access. China has implemented all those policies and has had a significant impact on driving its global growth. So essentially, what China wants is autarky in advanced technology industries. So its National Integrated Circuit Plan calls for, quote, having their imports of US semiconductors by 2025 and eliminating them entirely by 2030. So China wants to fully service domestically its own market for civilian aircraft and solar panels and high-speed rail and everything, but it wants access to global markets. So China wants globalization on its terms that benefit only it and not others, in our view, at ITIF. And that's why it's incumbent on policymakers in the West and like-minded countries to say, no, that's not the deal you signed up to when we said you could join the WTO in 2001. And your trade and economic policymaking needs to go forward on a consistent basis with WTO rules, because that's what we've architected in a way that enables all of global society to flourish, not just one small part of the country. So there's no question right now there's a battle being fought for the soul of globalization, and again that's why when we're not enforcing the rules as we construct them, like America failed to do for the past 2 decades, which led to this populist rise, those are the consequences we face if we're not able to get the system right for the benefit of all.
Let's go back to transatlantic relations. And Tony, I have to ask you about, well, we are Polish people I talked to you from Warsaw, Poland. We just had this unfortunate accident at our eastern border that the missile from Ukraine, killed 2 people at the Polish border with Ukraine. So the future is unknown. We are all worried. But I want to ask you about the perception in the US, about the perception of threats, first of all. And maybe also if there is any comment you can make on Poland itself, as a country. How do you think, if any, we are seen or reported, and what is the American public thinking about Central Eastern Europe right now?
So to begin with the first question, the threat perception, I think it depends on who you ask. I think in the policymaking community here in DC, I think that there's a very clear idea of what the threat is, and it's being taken very seriously. Earlier on, I think Stephen had mentioned the idea of war fatigue. That, I believe, is the case at the policymaking level all the way down to the public level. And so when we see missiles falling, whether it was intentional or otherwise, on NATO territory, that raises a lot of alarms here and causes a lot of consternation among the people and policymakers with what are we prepared to do? We know we have obligations under our under NATO treaties, but what are we actually prepared to do? What are we actually prepared to sell as policymakers to the American people who want no part of military adventures anywhere, regardless of our NATO obligations? Those things really cause me a lot of concern when I think about the threats and what we should be doing about it. And if I were sitting in Warsaw or Tallinn or anywhere in Europe, I'd be thinking very long and hard about the reliability of Americans when it comes to our NATO obligations and protecting the European front. That's one issue around threat perception.
So do you want to say that the Americans may have doubts about, in what way, if any, they should be involved?
I think I would say the American public has a lot of doubts, and I would say if you took a poll today of what percentage of Americans would support American troops on the ground in Poland to defend Poland against Russia, I don't think you'd have a very high number of Americans supporting that type of intervention, regardless of our NATO obligations. because most people don't understand Article 5 anyway. So I'd be surprised if you would see a high level of support for that. I would say anything outside of a direct attack on the American homeland, I wouldn't say that you would find widespread support for any military interventions anywhere, period. Stephen, do you want to jump in on that?
Unless Russia goes nuclear.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably true. When it comes to the question of how Poland is perceived, it's a really complicated question, I think, for me, and from people that I talk to here who pay attention to what's happening in Europe, and particularly in Central Europe. There's been a lot of respect for the way Poland has managed this whole situation with Ukraine and Russia, and been a leader across the European Union when it comes to being a stalwart supporter of Ukraine. That combined, though, with some of the domestic challenges that we've seen, the rule of law issues that we see, the erosion of democracy in Poland, that doesn't go unnoticed here. And so maintaining the balance from a perception perspective, what matters more at this moment in time, it really depends on who you ask. But I think that both can be true. We can be concerned about democracy issues in Poland and still respect what you all have done when it comes to Ukraine. But it is complicated. I would say the average American on the street doesn't think a lot about decisions that Poland makes on a day-to-day basis when it comes to geopolitics or its own domestic politics. There are plenty of communities around the United States, whether it be Chicago or anywhere else, where there's a huge Polish community, where every cultural festival, there are a lot of warm feelings about Poland. So that still exists. But when it comes to the policymaking issues, the average American probably is not paying attention to these things. The average policymaker is probably really conflicted about Poland at the moment. Stephen, your comment?
Well, I'd echo everything Tony said, and also note that there has been a special respect for Poland with the way it's taken in, as I understand, almost 7 to 8 million immigrants who fled the war in Ukraine. There's a real sense that Poland has shouldered responsibilities there. Preparing for our conversation today, did a little research, and one of the things that popped up was an article in The Guardian this morning titled, "Is Washington Still Our Ally? EU accuses US of profiteering from Ukraine war through sales of guns and gas," pointing out that the average gas prices Europeans pay are 4 times more than Americans, and contending that we're making a lot of money off selling arms for the war, and pointing out the spat over the subsidies for electric vehicles. And it occurs to me as I read through that piece and the reactions from both sides is there's also a sense in America, this is of Europe, not of Poland, because I want to contradistinct Poland from which I think has done a great job responding to the war. But there's a sense, I think, on the ground in America of Europe needs to get its act together. Why are we the ones who are having to step in and supply the gas, having to step in and supply the arms? Because Europe has not tended to its economy, to its industrial structure, to its ability to produce energy. And I think that's part of the sense of Americans on this war fatigue as well. Is we got to come to the now we're the ones who we got to step in and support this effort as well. So I point this out because I think Poland's doing a great job in this regard, much better than the rest of Europe, and I think that is recognized in America.
Thank you for this conversation, as I think we strongly believe here in Europe that we should do everything possible to better understand each other. The Americans and the Europeans should have not only interactions in the time of war, but it should be a much deeper understanding between these two places on Earth and the societies we are representing. So thanks for that. And before we finish, I just want Tony just to say briefly about this project, which can help us to do that. Transatlantic Periscope, the Bertelsmann Foundation just launched this this month.
Thanks for the opportunity. No, it's great, Małgorzata. And just a word, if you are interested in understanding the relationships between the United States and each of the 27 member states, we've created a platform called the Transatlantic Periscope, which you can find at transatlanticperiscope.org. And we have partners in each of the 27 member states to tell us what are the things that are most important on the agenda between the United States and each European member state. In Poland, for example, our partner is the Center for International Relations. Małgorzata and her team are working to give you the best information about what's important. If you want to understand the key issues driving this relationship, this is the place to go. So this is just another tool for understanding a really complicated and complex series of relationships. And it's there at the tip of your fingers. It's free and available online. Hope you'll visit. Thanks, Małgorzata, for that.
Thank you so much, both of you. So we were talking about the Americans' perception of the war and Europe, about how we see, also from the Euro perspective, the changes in the US. And we were having today Anthony Silberfeld from Bertelsmann Foundation, Director of Transatlantic Department. Thank you, Tony, once again. And Stephen Ezell, Vice President of Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in Washington, and also the leader of the network of think tanks all over the globe in order to promote free trade and innovations. Thank you, both of you. My name is Małgorzata Bonikowska. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you join us for the next session of our Zoom the World series. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.